Hi guys, and welcome back. In this video, let's take a look at one of my favorite features in Kubectl, which is the Kubectl exec command. And the exec command, if we take a look at the help on it, is going to allow us to spawn some kind of interactive process, a command, within a container. Now, it doesn't have to be interactive. You could actually just kick off a command in a container asynchronously that's maybe running some kind of task within that container's context. But it's often very useful to use the exec command with a couple of options that are right down here, the standard in and TTY options, to actually make the container interactive so that we can spawn a remote shell into a pod, and then we can start to explore the data that's inside of that pod. We can take a look at log files, we can run different types of diagnostic commands, we could install and attach a debugger to the core process that's running inside of there as well. And so you've got a lot of different options in terms of what you can do here. So what we're going to do is run kubectl exec, and then we're going to need to specify which pod we want to exec into. And once we specify the pod, we can also optionally specify a container name. So if you recall from other videos where we've talked about deploying workloads, pods can have more than one container inside of them. It's oftentimes that you'll find just one container in a pod, like maybe a web server application. But if you have a different configuration where maybe you're deploying a web application and you're deploying a sidecar container with a logging agent like FluentD, for example, then you can have more than one container running in that pod. So when we do a kubectl exec command, we have the ability to specify which container in that pod we want to spawn this command on. And we can specify that as a name. So when we take a look at a pod, we can say, okay, there's two different containers. There's a container named web server, and there's a second container called logging agent. And so we could specify with this container parameter which of those containers we exactly want to attach to. So then we also have the standard in and TTY options right down here, and that basically just allows us to make the container interactive or make the process that we're spawning in that container interactive. And then we can also specify, if we would like to, the quiet option here, and that will basically just print out output from the remote command instead of printing any kubectl output as well. So let's go ahead and explore how exactly this could work. And so for starters, what I'm going to do is just deploy a sample web application. So I'll do a kubectl create namespace, and we'll call it nginx right here. And then I'm going to go ahead and spawn an nginx pod inside of this namespace. So we'll do a kubectl, and then we'll do a run command, specify the nginx image, specify the port 80 that we want to expose from there, and then I'll just call this nginx 01. And that should go ahead and just spin up a new pod here. And it looks like that already exists. So let me actually make sure I specify the namespace. I think I already had a pod named nginx01, but that's in the default namespace. So I'm going to go ahead and specify my nginx namespace here. And sure enough, you can see that we've successfully created that pod. So if we do a kubectl namespace nginx get pod, we should see that pod up and running. Sure enough, there it is. All right, so now let's say that we want to exec into that pod and get a remote shell so that we can explore the log files in that nginx application. So what we could do is run kubectl, and then we could do exec, and then standard in, and then TTY, and we could do the pod name. So we'll do pod/nginx01, and now we can specify a command. So typically what you'll do is just do a double dash. That's kind of a separator, and then the command that you want to run. Now, of course, the command that you specify on the right-hand side of this operator here does need to exist inside of that container that we're attaching to. So if the nginx container did not have the sh shell inside of it, then the command would fail. So let's try, for example, running bash and see if bash is inside of there. And sure enough, bash is actually pre-installed into the nginx container image. But if we were to try to run an alternative shell, like PowerShell, for example, then PowerShell is not pre-installed into the Nginx container image that's available on the Docker Hub. So of course the pwsh command is going to fail. However, if you customized the Nginx container image and you did install PowerShell into that image so that you could debug using PowerShell and exec into it using the PowerShell shell, then you could of course use this command here. But because PowerShell is not pre-installed in the Nginx container image, we only have the option to use either bash, or we could try sh as well. And I'm pretty sure that sh is in there, and sure enough you can see that we get an sh shell here as well. So both bash and sh are going to be options that we could use in there. So let's go ahead and just attach to the bash shell here. And now we could just do an ls command. We can kind of explore the file system here. We could perhaps go into the var log directory here and check out, the Nginx logs. We can run maybe a cat command against these logs here. So let's just cd into that directory. And let's do a cat on access logged here. So we'll do cat access log. And that would basically show us anything that's inside of that log file. Now this log file is actually pointing over to standard output. So it's actually going to attach to standard output and basically block execution there. So in this particular case, that's not really a great example, but we could also go ahead and just do a Control-C, and then we could look at other files that are on the file system, like this dpackage log, for example, here. If we just do an ls-ll, that is not a symbolic link, it's just a file on the file system. So we could do cat dpackage.log. We could grep through that log file. We could say maybe grep status, for example, and start to filter the data that's inside of that log file. And then once we're done using our interactive shell here, maybe we run some different commands to get some information about the execution environment of our Nginx application, we can just exit out of that shell, and our Nginx container that's running in that pod is still going to continue executing. So if we run just a kubectl --namespace Nginx get pods, we should see that that Nginx process, sure enough, is still running here. Now, if you're not sure what the names of the containers are inside of that application, then you could actually just do a kubectl describe. So let's do a kubectl namespace Nginx describe pod. And of course, I could do a describe pod Nginx01, but if we don't specify a pod name, then it'll just describe all of the pods in there. And we can now explore the containers section of the pod output here. So you can see we've got a pod named Nginx01. It exists in the Nginx namespace. And then if we take a look at the containers section right down here, this is where it's actually going to show us the names of the individual containers inside of that pod. So if we wanted to explicitly specify the name of that container, in this case, we would use Nginx01. And if we had multiple containers, we'd have to specify which container exactly we want to connect to. Whereas if there's only one container, we don't have to specify that option. But just to show you a quick example here, if we do a kubectl exec and then add in the container option and set that equal to the name of the container, Nginx01, then it's going to successfully attach. However, if we were to specify an invalid container, like I know we don't have a name container in there called fluentd, but if we did, we could theoretically connect to it. But you'll get an error message basically just indicating that the container with the specified name, in this case fluentd, is not valid inside of this particular pod. So that's what you would see if the container doesn't exist. However, if you did have a multi-container application, or multi-application or multi-container pod in particular, then you would be able to specify the name of that container that you want to attach to. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.